Thanks so much, Isaiah. So what I want to do today is talk about Kant's idea that in a rightful condition, it's possible for the citizens to rule themselves through their institutions, to give laws to themselves. I want to do this is part of a larger project on the Kantian conception of public right, but the part that I want to talk about today is on the narrower question of the sense in which laws can be self-imposed. The idea that laws are self-imposed is, of course, an idea you hear frequently. It's an idea that's kind of appealing, perhaps even uplifting, and it is also, of course, deeply puzzling about the sense in which that could actually be true, such that on the one hand it would be something we cared about, and on the other hand it would be something that could somehow be achievable in the kinds of political institutions that human beings live under or could realistically hope to live under. So that is my aim. I'm going to explain it partly in terms of concepts of public right, but I want to, in honor of Kant's 300th birthday and also to keep my promise to Emily Carson, put it in terms of broader concepts from Kant's theoretical philosophy, and in particular, Kant's concept of the synthetic a priori. Why do I want to talk about the synthetic a priori? Not merely to keep my promise, which is an instance of a synthetic a priori principle, I might note, but rather because a synthetic a priori principle in Kant has the formal structure that we need in order to make sense of the idea of people giving laws to themselves. Because a synthetic a priori principle is a principle that connects something to something else that is distinct from it. Kant gives lots of examples. I'm going to just mention one from the Doctrine of Right, then I will mention one from the Critique of Pure Reason, and then I will explain why my question of how it's possible for people to give laws to themselves is, again, something that can only be addressed in terms of the concept of a synthetic a priori principle. First example, contract. You and I make an agreement. I promise to deliver you 100 pounds of green coffee beans next Wednesday. There is my promise and your acceptance of my promise. We've made the contract. And then there is our performance, my delivery of the coffee beans, and you paying me for that delivery. Those are distinct from each other. We have two sets of transactions. How is it that one can be related to the other? The answer is through the principle of contract, but the principle of contract is a synthetic principle because it is joining things that are distinct from each other, but it's an a priori principle. Why do I say that? Because it is a principle that explains how there can be necessitation with respect to a contingent matter. If you and I make the contract with respect to coffee beans, it's binding in just the same way as if either of us had made our part of the contract with someone else, or if we had instead made our contract with respect to potatoes. What the matter of choice is doesn't matter. It is the form of connection. You need an a priori principle rather than a merely empirical principle. Another way of seeing this point is to note that the bindingness of contract does not depend on the fact that we agreed to it in advance. It's rather having agreed to it could only be binding if agreements are already binding. So the principle, the Latin, put in Latin, pacta sunt servanda, contracts are to be kept, is an a priori principle, and it is synthetic because it connects things distinct from each other. Next example from the Critique of Pure Reason, in fact, the same example, cause and effect. A cause and its effect are distinct from each other, not necessarily distinct in time. There can be simultaneous causation, but the cause and its effect are distinct things, and the question for philosophy is how is it that these things could be connected to each other? Once again, we have necessitation. The effect happens because of the cause, but it is with respect to a contingent matter. That is, the principle of causality holds in general, and we can apply it to the contingent matter of the course of experience. So a synthetic a priori principle then is one that connects distinct things to each other and allows us to understand the possibility of necessitation. Notice how the question of how laws can be self-imposed has exactly the same structure. You vote in the election, or you, as a member of parliament, vote in deciding. Whatever it is, that is the thing, the first part, but that's distinct from later, having voted for this law. Let's suppose for now that you voted for this law. Having voted for this law, you are now bound by it on future performances. On future occasions, you have to do that which you agreed to in some sense of agreement through your vote. And so it is a synthetic principle connecting distinct things to each other, but it's a synthetic principle that governs a contingent matter. It's a form of necessity because you have to obey. Why do you have to obey? Because it's the law. Why is it the law? Because through the relevant processes, people voted for it. But the synthetic principle governs a contingent matter. If the people had voted for a different law, we'll see there are limits on the laws to which this applied, but nonetheless, within a certain range, if people had voted for a different law, it would be the one that was binding. If the law said that you had to drive on the left side of the road rather than the right, that is where you would have to drive. You would have to do that even though it could have gone the other way. Now, what we need then is a way of understanding how it is that the bindingness of law can be understood as something that you, as a voter, as a citizen, have imposed on yourself. Let me say something more about the way in which the matter that is necessitated is contingent. There are two aspects of contingency within any form of government. First of all, there is the contingency of who. People care a lot about the outcome of elections precisely because everyone gets that depending on who wins, there will be different rules made, different interpretations of the rules, and so on. Indeed, political life is full of this. If you are suing someone or if you are charged with a crime, it depends who's on the jury. It depends who the judge is. And so there is a contingency to the who. And yet necessitation, because the judge's decision is binding regardless of who in particular they happen to be. Second, with respect to more generally the content, because of course there are lots of laws that we think of as things that could have gone differently but still be binding. Let me give you a really anodyne example of this, just to make it clear that this shows up with respect to things that matter a lot, but we don't think of as raising great questions of justice. Think about daylight savings time. Most of North America, other than Saskatchewan, has daylight savings time. Mexico has daylight savings time. Big question for Mexico about whether to do it, because the normal reasons you might do it don't really apply there. So why do we have daylight savings time? Argument in favor, proper public purpose. Let people have nicer lives by being able to go out in the evening and have it still be sunny in the summer, and let them drive to work before it gets, after it gets light in the winter. Excellent reason in favor of daylight savings time, that is, of switching back and forth. Here's the reason against. On the switch days, there are many more car accidents, and there are people who die because of this decision of convenience. So what do you do? And the answer is the job of the legislature contemplating the Daylight Savings Time Act is to figure out what to do. There are good arguments on both sides. There are properly public purposes on both sides. And what they have to do is combine them in a way. Here's another more freighted example, closing of schools during the pandemic. It protected the public health system. That's a really good public purpose. And it had all kinds of bad consequences for children's mental health and educational development. How do you combine these? And the answer is, it is some official's job to combine them. But it's contingent. But once the decision is made, it is binding. And so the question is, how can there be binding decisions with respect to a contingent subject matter where we can trace that bindingness to the idea of the citizens having somehow given the laws to themselves? So in Kant's earlier political writings in What is Enlightenment and on the Common Saying, he talks a lot about the laws to which the citizens could consent. But in Perpetual Peace, and again in the Doctrine of Right, he goes further. And he talks, the Doctrine of Right wording is even more striking, about one of the attributes of a citizen as having to obey no law to which he has not given his consent. It sounds like there is talk about having actually agreed to things. The question is, again, it's uplifting. Kant quotes the Latin maxim, volenti non fit injuria. No one is wronged through their own act. So in what sense is the making of laws your own act? Well, I want to start by dismissing a few possibilities before going to Kant's distinctive solution. One possibility that can be dismissed is the idea that you have, in fact, actually agreed to the content of all of the particular laws. That doesn't tend to happen in democracies, but more than that, of course, whatever the principle is that makes government decisions valid makes them binding, makes them impose legal obligations even on people who don't agree with them. And so the first worry is that if you think about actual consent as a kind of datable event, there's going to be a puzzle about how it could apply to this kind of case. But that's just a symptom of a deeper problem. The deeper problem is if you think about actual consent as it figures in everyday life, in private interactions, it seems to be the wrong model. That's because there are two versions of actual consent that figure in ordinary life, and neither of them is suitable. One is the kind of consent that you give to your stylist as they are cutting your hair. If I cut your hair without your permission, that would be a wrong against you. It would be a battery. But when you go in and you tell the stylist to cut your hair, it's not a battery. Why? Because you've consented to it. Because in some sense, the stylist's act is your act. You've agreed to it. Straightforward application of the Valenti principle. So too, I come to visit you. I'm not a trespasser because you have allowed me into your home. But notice that with both the haircut case and with the visiting case, you can revoke your consent at any time. If you halfway through your haircut, you say, no, you have to stop, you may end up looking ridiculous. But you're allowed to do that, and if the stylist continues, despite the fact that in fact you will look better if they continue, they're committing a wrong against you. So too, when I'm visiting you, you can kick me out. You can say, okay, I've had enough of your company, and then I have to leave, and if I stay, I'm a trespasser. So in these kinds of transactions, the problem is that because it can be revoked, not only is it not a model of the way in which laws are binding, but it's not a model because, to use more Kantian vocabulary, it's not a synthetic principle at all. It's just analytic. And that's why as soon as you stop allowing the stylist to cut your hair or me to visit you, we've overstayed our welcome and it's no longer a permission. But of course that couldn't give you a model of obligation, because an obligation is something that tells you you have to do something even if you don't want to do it. It tells you that someone else gets to do something to you even if you don't want them to do it. So a better model might be thought to lie in the idea of a contract, one of my synthetic a priori principles. The difficulty with that model is that in making a contract, you are free to enter into or not enter into a contract based entirely on your own matter of choice. Go back to my example of buying green coffee beans from me. If you don't roast your own coffee, or worse yet, you don't even drink coffee, in that case, you're not going to be interested in this agreement with me. You don't have to do it. It's purely voluntary, and it's purely voluntary based entirely on the matter of choice. There's a further difficulty with the kind of contract model, which is that Kant himself thinks that contracts are only binding subject to public law. And so there's that problem, but the more fundamental problem is that it's a purely private choice, and so it doesn't seem to count. And there's yet another problem, which is that a contract can only change the rights of those who are party to it. And so it can't be that all of us voting get to make a rule that binds people who are, say, born later, come to Canada later, or anything like that. It's too much of a private arrangement. So if actual consent in that sense won't work, what about the alternative that figures prominently in the literature and that I alluded to at the beginning of my remarks? That is, what about the idea of hypothetical consent? So Kant talks about the laws that a people could give itself, and the basic idea behind the idea of hypothetical consent is that there are limits on the ways in which, on the laws to which a people could agree, and therefore anything to which the people could not agree could not be binding, could not be a law imposed on them by their government. But notice that the question of possible agreement, see, Emily, I didn't tell you this, but more Kant's theoretical philosophy is, of course, a concept of modality. But in order to think of laws as self-imposed, we can't think of them merely as possibly self-imposed. We need not the category of possibility, but the category of actuality. Possible agreement doesn't give you the category of actuality. We need some way of understanding how there can be a determination such that it is actual agreement. Another way of thinking about this point is to realize that much of post-World War II constitutional law can be understood in terms of charters of rights like Canada and Germany have, that restrict the lawmaking power of government to what is consistent with dignity or what is consistent with the idea of a free and democratic society, which is to say what it is that the people could agree to. But that radically under-constrains what the content of the laws is. That it is not constitutional doesn't make it binding. It needs to actually be made binding. And the question is, how can that particularity come? So in order to get to Kant's explanation of this, I want to turn to one of his examples of a law that the people could not give itself. This is his last and most extended example. He talks about the case of a hereditary bureaucracy. Those of you who've studied Hegel's doctrine, philosophy of right know that Hegel is in favor of a hereditary bureaucracy. Those of you who have read Thomas Mann's novel Buddenbrooks get a picture of what a hereditary bureaucracy is like. Kant thinks there cannot be a hereditary bureaucracy because the people could not, as he puts it, throw away their freedom. They could not give themselves a law whereby occupation of public offices is determined by birth. And he says something interesting here, and slightly puzzling initially. He says this is because merit for public office is not the kind of thing that can be inherited. And some people read him to be engaging in a kind of speculative genetics and saying, oh, it turns out that it's It's nurture, not nature, that makes people good at things. That's not it at all. As always, when Kant talks about inheritance, he is talking about it in juridical terms, not in biological terms. Indeed, even one more first critique reference. When he talks about the categories needing another birth certificate, it's a Geburtsbrief, which is showing your status as sui juris rather than showing who your parents were. But he says can't be inherited because it isn't held privately. It's not the kind of thing that parent can bequeath to child. Central debate in 18th century law was whether inheritance was at the will of the testator or ran through the family. That was in fact what the War of the Austrian Succession was fought over that putative legal principle. Kant is on the at the will of the testator, but on either side, a public office is not the kind of thing that is someone's belonging, such that they can give it to someone else, that they can sell it to someone else, or that someone else can inherit it from them simply in virtue of being their eldest male child. It's the wrong kind of thing. And so it is not within the people's rightful power to make a rule allowing this. Now, here's the other side of that example. If a public suitability for public office is not a matter of something had privately as part of somebody's patrimony, what is it? How is it that a public official gets to exercise the powers that they do? Kant's answer is that, actually let me back up a step. Kant's answer depends on the thought that a public official acts as a part of a public legal order. Now, a public legal order is what Kant calls a moral person. He's not saying it's good in calling it a moral person. It's an 18th century term. Typically now, the idiom used is an artificial person. A corporation is an artificial person, a university is an artificial person, and a legal order is an artificial person. An artificial person can do all kinds of things. It can own property, it can sue and be sued, it can be wronged, it can commit wrongs. But of course, an artificial person can only act through natural persons. An artificial person, such as the state, can only act through its public officials. The reason that public office is not the kind of thing that can be inherited or bequeathed or sold or given as a gift is precisely that it is distinctively public. It is the authorization to act for the public authority. Now, something else about the nature of this authorization, which comes back to the two contingencies that I mentioned at the beginning. Every time someone has a public office, they have a job description. And their job description always comes with a certain degree of discretion. If you think about my example from the pandemic, the medical officer of health has to consider, on the one hand, the health consequences of keeping schools open, and on the other hand, the health consequences of closing schools. Almost every mandate has multiple dimensions to it, multiple grounds that the official is supposed to consider. I say almost everyone because I learned that in St. Catharines, Ontario, there is a fence officer who makes sure that fences are not too tall, and that person just works with a tape measure and so quite literally has a one-dimensional mandate. But ordinarily, any public office is going to have a multidimensional mandate. What the official has to do is, within their mandate, take account of multiple factors that are part of it. Now, in doing that, notice that the official gets to do things that private persons don't get to do and doesn't get to do the main thing that private persons get to do. As a private person, you can do whatever you want unless it's expressly prohibited. Unless it is prohibited either by the rights of other private persons or by public law. As a public official, on the other hand, you don't get to do anything at all unless it's expressly permitted by your mandate. And so you're in a fundamentally different position, which is why that can't be passed on. But the other side of a public office is that as a public official, you get to do something that private persons do not get to do. John Rawls famously said that the problem with utilitarianism is that it takes the principle for one person and treats it as the principle for society. That's not true, because that's not the principle. Maximization is not the principle for one person. You're allowed to aggregate across your various interests. You're allowed to maximize the sum of your satisfactions as a private person. You don't have to. It's up to you. You just combine your different ends as you see fit, limited only by the rights of other people. A public official, on the other hand, again, I return to the daylight savings time example and to the pandemic example, actually not only gets to, but sometimes has to aggregate across persons. The public official deciding about daylight savings time needs to make the hard decision. Whatever we do in this situation is going to be good for some people and bad for other people. There's no option that doesn't have that feature, and so has to decide. That is both the burden of office and the power of office. But that power of office could only be consistent with right, provided that it is exercised subject to a strict mandate. But if that's what an office is, then notice that every office is going to need, and here we come back to the hereditary nobility case, is going to need to have a mode of appointment and is going to need to have a mode of oversight. And so who appoints, we'll start with the one-dimensional mandate, who appoints the fence inspector? I guess it is the city bylaw commissioner. But of course, the city bylaw commissioner gets to figure out how many fence inspectors there are going to be and how many people doing perhaps more pressing things there are going to be. And who decides what the powers of the city bylaw commissioner is going to be? That's decided by the city council. Who decides the powers of the city council? Well, in some sense, that's decided by the city, and in some sense, it's decided by the higher level of government. And eventually, you get to the highest level of government that decides all of the mandates below it. But then, of course, we have a question: who decides on the scope of the highest level of government? What is the method of appointment and oversight of the highest level of government? And I think you can see where I'm going. It is the citizens themselves voting. What are they doing in doing that? They are determining who it is that will make the rules and how they will make the rules. But now notice, although I just described it as the highest level of government, and I don't mean to take that back, I do mean to qualify it. Maybe I should call it not the highest, but rather the apex level of government. And then note that there is another level of government above it. Because notice that in all of the examples, as we, as it were, made our way up the pyramid of governance here, each level is filled with officials, and each official is overseen by another official. And I want to suggest that the same thing is true with respect to the voters who are choosing the officials, who will choose the other officials and make the rules about what their offices require. And how are we to understand that? When you vote, you're actually not acting in a private capacity, but rather acting in a public capacity. Let me illustrate this with a small-scale example that will be familiar to many of you. Suppose that you are on the committee that is charged with selecting the new head of your academic unit. We'll make this a philosophy department just for purposes of familiarity to many of you. You're supposed to choose the next department head. What do you do? Now, obviously, I'm going to need to make a little bit of this just totally fictitious because I'm going to imagine that there are candidates with platforms, but as we all have known since Plato's Republic, the philosopher needs to be forced to rule and would never do it voluntarily. But let's suppose we have an atypical philosophy department and there are two candidates and each of them has what we might describe as their platform. One of them says, actually there are going to be three candidates, sorry. One of them says, we're going to increase enrollment. That way we'll get more resources from the dean. Another of them says, we're going to focus on what's genuinely interesting and we're not going to care about enrollment. And then one of those two has views about what they're going to do by way of private fundraising. One of them has ambitions. Johns Hopkins University did get $75 million for its philosophy department. They say, we're going to get $150 million for our philosophy department. And the other one says perhaps, well, we're going to do this instead, and so on. So how do you choose between them? Well, the answer is, in choosing between them, you have a job to do. What are you supposed to do? Well, on the one hand, you need to look at their platforms and see what seems like an appropriate thing for your department to do. The appropriateness of the various platforms depends in part on your view about what someone can successfully do. The person who says they're going to raise $150 million that does not like talking to rich people is probably not the right person for the job as they have characterized it. So too, the person who says we're going to increase enrollment needs to have a view about how to do that. And so the point is, there are various relations between a person's capacity and what they say they're going to do. But now we have candidate 3. Candidate 3 says, I don't approve of the modern university. I think what we should do is instead devote ourselves entirely to the alleviation of some problem or other. Pick your favorite problem, some pressing global problem. We should be activists, not academics. That person is not, although they may be a real candidate, your job description precludes you from choosing them. Why? Because your job description is to choose someone to lead this academic unit. Your job description is not to choose someone who will use this academic unit to turn it, or will turn this academic unit into something entirely distinct from it. Here's something else that you're not allowed to do. You are not allowed to choose a candidate based on your private purposes. So suppose there is someone who is a potential candidate for chair of the department. You're on the committee and you think, if that person becomes chair, they'll get teaching release. That means I'll get to teach my favorite course, that is the Critique of Pure Reason. And it turns out that is an improper motive. You would be acting outside your office if you chose a leader of your unit on those grounds. And so notice, we have a complex structure here, the basic features of which are the fact that you have to figure out what you think within limits, that is, turning it into something else is not an option, what the proper purposes of your department are. You have to think about how competent they are going to be at achieving them. You have to think about their interpersonal and managerial skills. And you have to stop yourself from thinking about what's in it for you as private person, though of course you can think about what's in it for you as department member, that is, as someone who is engaged in a common purpose. Now notice something else about this example. A non-trivial part of your job in selecting the person to do the job of unit head is a matter of considering the same factors that it will be the job of the unit head to consider. That is, relative priorities, all of those things. You have to think about them. Why? Because you are overseeing the way in which they will carry them out, and so you need to think about all of them. At the same time, in exercising your power of oversight and selection, you are not running the department. What you are doing is figuring out who will fill that office. Now, if we think about it that way, we can notice that the same structure applies to what I call the above the apex, highest level of democratic participation. Your job is to choose the public officials who are going to be able to make the laws such that they will set out the mandates such that we can create a system within which everyone can exercise their freedom consistently with everyone else. And so your job is a job, on the one hand, of considering these broad priorities. On the other hand, considering the suitability of someone to realize those broad priorities. And bringing those things together, you need to combine multiple factors, think how they should fit together. And of course, it will turn out that there may be no perfect candidate. There may be no one who is going to be fully aligned with your view of the priorities. But notice, your job is not simply one of oversight. It's not that you are the ruler and then whoever is prime minister or your member of the legislature is merely your private delegate. It's rather that your job description is itself part of a system of offices, which is to say you vote with all of the other voters, and your job is to do your part in making the collective decision. So, when you vote, you are exercising the powers of a public office. It has the two features I said public offices have. On the one hand, you are not allowed to do anything other than act for the purposes of the mandate. On the other hand, it has the feature that you are allowed to, and indeed, in some sense, bound to, engage in a certain amount of aggregative thinking. You need to think about how this is going to play out for everyone. Of course, you will have your own limited and partial and non-expert perspective on all of these things, just as you did, in fact, with respect to, for example, the interpersonal skills or fundraising ability of the candidates for your unit head. They're all things about which you can know a bit, and you won't know everything. You are an imperfect decision maker, but it is consistent with doing your job that you exercise your own judgment in this constrained way. Now, of course, there is one difference between this kind of office and all of the other offices. Because all of the other offices I described, and indeed this is how I got to this as the highest level, are all offices where there is an appointment procedure. Whereas being a voter is not an office for which there is an appointment procedure in the same sense. There's an appointment procedure in the weaker sense of being a born or naturalized citizen of the country. And the question is, why is it that this is the body that is charged with deciding about the highest level office holders? And my answer to that question will also provide an answer to the a fuller specification of the sense in which this counts as the laws truly being self-imposed, that the people really have, we, the people, have given laws to ourselves. Think back to the idea that I introduced a few minutes ago of an artificial person and the way in which an artificial person can only act through natural persons. The only way in which there can be the public person that is the legal order is if it does things. The only way it can be a distinctively public person, apart from the private purposes of the human beings that make it up, is by it doing things. But it can only do things by people occupying offices. The pure case of the people constituting themselves as a public person is just the case in which their act is to establish and fill all of the offices. If they do that, they can only do it in a way that is consistent with hypothetical consent, that is only something to which the citizens could agree, but they need to make it actual. But in making it actual, they collectively are creating the conditions under which there are laws, not merely possible laws, but actual laws. And so the citizens, as a collective body, give the laws to themselves. If we understand it in this way, we also can understand why Kant, in the passage that I quoted at the beginning about the citizen having the attribute as citizen of obeying no law to which he has not given his consent, as a citizen you have agreed to it through your participation in this office of law-giving. As a private person, your consent isn't relevant. It is that you can have this public persona, which is the precondition of everyone consistently enjoying their freedom. Let me come back, in conclusion, to the real world of politics. Kantian political philosophy is often accused of excessive idealization. It's often accused of imagining that people are much better than they are, or that institutions are somehow more functional than they really are. And of course, other times it's accused of being too realistic and too willing to acquiesce in all kinds of injustices. And I want to say, no, it's neither of those things. The picture of people giving laws to themselves addresses the question of how it is that the laws can be binding, can be traced back to the choices of the citizens who are bound by those laws. And so collectively we bind ourselves, not could bind ourselves, but do bind ourselves, such that we are thereby each individually bound by it. Omnes et singuli, as Kant puts it. We're not wronged by those laws because they are not the act of anyone other than us. Now that might just raise the worry about this being too pure and ideal a pure case, but I want to suggest that we can actually understand it as fitting with the imperfect world in which we find ourselves. We can understand it that way because we can understand that, of course, not everyone takes their office seriously. We have a word for public officials who fail to take their offices seriously. The public official who takes a bribe, the public official who redirects resources to friends and family. We call them corrupt. The way in which they are corrupt is not necessarily that they commit any private wrong, though frequently they do, but rather because they act in a way that is, as Kant puts it in the closing sections of Private Right, wrong in the highest degree. They act in a way that's inconsistent with the possibility of public legal order at all. And they may do that in a way that is so small scale. The parking meter, when they used to have coins and parking meters, the parking meter attendant who pilfers, not going to undermine the rightful condition, but is acting in a way that is on a principle that's inconsistent with its possibility. The same thing, of course, is true for the public officials that we all are when we are supposed to vote. Lots of voters don't actually follow the mandates of their office. Lots of voters, of course, vote based on what they perceive to be their individual financial interest or on what they perceive to be their personal interest along some other dimension. And of course, lots of politicians give handouts to people who they think are going to vote for them. Both our provincial and federal government have recently promised us to give us $250 checks of our own money. That is, it seems, appealing not to a properly public purpose, but rather to the narrowly private purposes. Though one would hope that the fact that all parties are doing this will mean that they won't actually end up buying any votes for anyone. But fundamental point is, yes, of course things can go wrong in these ways. That they go wrong in these ways is not something that philosophy can prevent, but it's something that philosophy can let us properly understand why it is wrong and how it is wrongful. In Towards Perpetual Peace, Kant has a short criticism of Athenian democracy. He says it is entirely without form, and it is therefore the worst form of despotism. One way of thinking about that is the reason that, and whether he gets the facts of Athenian democracy correct need not concern us here. As he represents it, the Athenian assembly has absolute plenary power on all questions. As such, that means that that is a system that is without form because the voters have no job description. There is no restriction on the purposes for which they are allowed to make decisions. The Kantian model of democracy says that the possibility of the citizens ruling themselves rather than of some ruling others depends upon the thought that everyone has a job description, including every voter. That people don't always do their jobs is, of course, one of the pathologies of modern democracy, together with populism, the curse of money, and single-issue voters. These are all cases in which people fail to take their mandate seriously. The Kantian account, of course, cannot necessarily get people to behave better, but it can help us to understand what it is wrong, what goes wrong when democracy is privatized and then the people are no longer giving laws to themselves. Thank you.